Without getting his answer from Lord Indrath, Elder Winsome instructed him to leave, leaving him with no choice, so he left while Sylvia was sleeping. Later, outside the castle, the Arthur still doesn't get the point of that meeting. Although he could tolerate being judged by Lord Indrath, he wasn't prepared for Sylvia to be taken away. Elder Winsome explained that the relationship between Arthur and the Asuras was like a grudging tolerance. Because of this, their lord chose to make this meeting private, and the fact that they had no choice but to rely on a lesser being wound their pride. He assures the Arthur that he shouldn't worry because both he and Lady Sylvia would not be mistreated in their land, and both of them were very important to them. Arthur believed the words Lord Indrath said were necessary pieces in the war, but the same thing was what he guessed. Soon, they reached a place where the elder grabbed his arm and informed him that they were at the location, so he should hold on tightly. The Arthur was surprised to see the area as they had been walking for hours to train there. The Arthur was startled and started shouting as Elder Winsome threw him away, and his eyes spread out of shock when the tree trunk started covering his entire face. He was shocked and unable to understand the situation, but soon he was thrown into a different dimension. Soon after, Elder Winsome followed him and was delighted to see Cordry again. The bald man named Cordry appeared and was glad to see Elder Winsome again, and he approached them. Cordry recognized the Arthur, knowing he might be the human Arthur Lewin he had heard about. Elder Winsome introduced Cordry to the Arthur as he was his close friend and was from the Thiast's clans of the Pantheon Asura race, just like Aldir. The Arthur greeted him and was glad to meet him. Cordry looked at Winsome and inquired if Lord Indrath indeed granted him with the Ether Orb. Elder Winsome affirmed, which stunned Cordry as Lord Indrath had invested too much into this human. The Arthur continuously heard their conversation, and out of curiosity, he inquired what this Ether Orb was. Cordry went into the lake and uttered that his orb would help the Arthur in training immensely. He will borrow the dragon race's ability to influence ether, a powerful element that flows through and influences the entire universe. They could use the orb to separate the body from the soul and use its power to manipulate time. But the Arthur apologized and asked what he meant because he didn't understand a word. Elder Winsome explained that, along with the orb, Lord Indrath has allowed them to use his exclusive training ground. The ether-rich liquid inside this pond will help accelerate Arthur's training and heal wounds that he will incur throughout this process. The Arthur looked behind and was startled as suddenly the water was rising from the pond and wondered what was happening. Soon, his whole body was covered with water, and Elder Winsome looked at him and smiled as if he would see it soon. The Arthur remembered that they underwent 8 hours of combat training in his previous life at the institution, followed up with 10 hours of meditation to nurture their Kai centers. There was no denying that the training was flawed, but the only useful information that instructors had taught the Arthur was the vital spots of the human body. But their techniques were a brutish, senseless way of trying to inflict damage as, because of that violent training, he coughed out blood and furiously clenched his fist. Still, he had followed the instructor's training regimen to the bone and attended all the lessons he could. He grinned, and his instructor hurriedly kicked him before he could act and move away. Before his Kai Center had cultivated, he spent those training hours losing and failing against his classmates. The Arthur couldn't believe it as it was hilarious how easily memories from the past resurfaced when they were placed in similar situations. At the present moment, he was again fighting his instructor, Cordry, trying to defend himself by blocking his attacks and covering his face, yet he got kicked, flipped, and thrown away. He fell to the ground, and as soon as he opened his eyes, Arthur was startled as Cordry was at his head, ready to punch right at his face. He turned and managed to protect his face from the attack, yet his shoulder was punched hard, which caused a fracture and bruising. The pain was unbearable for him, so he shouted. Although in the worst conditions, he didn't give up and tried to stand. His whole body was trembling. Cordry rushed to attack him while Arthur tried his best to evade his attack. But after some time, he came out of the pond as that was enough training. Due to excessive damage and severe training, he was out of breath, and his eyes spread out with the shock of being tormented like this. The Arthur tried calming himself down while his instructor, Cordry, stood aside and observed him. After returning to his senses, he wiped his mouth, looked at Cordry, and told him he could keep going. Cordry was amazed and turned toward Elder Wisdom and remarked that the human boy had admirable willpower and inquired how much time had passed this time. Elder Winsome looked at the time and informed him that it was just 5 minutes out there, so Cordry roughly estimated that it might be an hour for them. Winsome looked at the Arthur, and he informed him that the more he was forced out of the soul realm, the more time would be wasted in his training. So, even with the slowing of time, he would not be ready for the war if Arthur were expelled every few minutes like that. While setting his hair, the Arthur urged not to blame him for that. Instead, Elder Winsome should blame his friend who killed him once every few minutes. Cordry was astounded and explained that he was doing only what the Arthur could handle. Even young Asuras, who don't die nearly as often as Arthur, did have a hard time coping with the stress. Yet Arthur was dealing with the sensation of dying quite well. His wonderful compliment amazed the Arthur, so Cordry suggested they continue training. They sit in the pond, close their eyes, and soon reach the parallel universe where Arthur is again poorly beaten. His whole face is swollen and bruised, and he again gets punched by Cordry. It has been over a week since Arthur started this Tortu training, and what he learned was Lord Indrath's exclusive training ground. When they began, Winsome explained that he would fight Cordry in his soul state, and thanks to the Ether Orb, the pain he felt while dying would be significantly diminished. It left Arthur wondering how unbearable the pain would be in the physical realm. Counting the time he spent out in the physical realm, eating, sleeping, and resting after dying too many times in the soul realm, he had spent over a few months in this grassland training with the well-tempered and patient Cordry. Cordry's attack pattern was always the same each time, but even after weeks, the Arthur was barely able to dodge. His instructor wants him to trust his body because, as long as he can, his body will be the only thing that will not fail him. After another fight, he comes out of the pond and is embarrassed, but that is just the difference in power between them. After some time, they go for another round. Arthur's eyes spread with fear as he gets attacked, and he's got a cut on his face. Then, he gets kicked by Cordry, but he manages to evade his few attacks. Cordry was delighted and applauded the Arthur, who kept up the match more extended than usual. He wants the Arthur to see past the pain his body can handle, so he doesn't want him to grow desperate and stay level-headed. Cordry attacked him with his elbow, which he managed to evade without being attentive toward the other attack, and he got kicked in his face and thrown away. He was again lying on the grassland with a swollen and injured face when Cordry approached him and remarked that Arthur managed not to get himself killed. He instructed the Arthur to rest until his soul state was healed. Abruptly, Arthur's injured parts started shining, and all of his injuries healed. The Arthur stands to fight again, but Cordry instructs him to take a break from combat training for a while. The Arthur wonders what his instructors mean and inquires if he is not learning fast enough. Cordry shakes his head and denies it because the Arthur's ability to grasp and comprehend is quite frightening. Because of his stubbornness, Cordry was afraid that Arthur would break if they kept going at the current pace unwittingly. The Arthur needs clarification about knowing that he will break, as he thinks the realm inside the Ether Orb will not allow him to die. Besides, Arthur felt his soul state was regenerating rapidly as long as Cordry didn't kill him instantly. He was confident he should be okay. Cordry explained that he wasn't talking about the Arthur's body, but about injuries in his mind. Currently, Arthur is experiencing constant death, but death is no longer an endpoint, but the precursor of a level of pain that even Asuras finds daunting. That kind of trauma will start to get in the way of producing the sort of fighter he was training Arthur to become. When they were talking about this level of pain, too much of it, and his body will instinctively try to save itself regardless of whether he wants it to or not. So, just enough pain will make it his most reliable sword and shield, which could adversely damage him. The Arthur stands after hearing this and clarifies that he is fine, so they don't need to rest. But he is startled by Cordry's horrifying aura. He furiously approached him, and then rushed and punched Arthur straight in his chest. Cordry's fist pierced through his body. The Arthur coughed out enormous blood and fell on the ground. Cordry called him and remarked that his experiences and instincts differed from most people. As much as there were things to be taught to Arthur, there were also many things he would have to unlearn simultaneously. He patted his head and promised to mold Arthur into an unparalleled fighter, not just among lesser beings but also among Asuras, and he pulled out his arm from his chest. He was trembling, but he didn't understand where it was because of the lethal wound in her chest or the excitement from training with a skilled mentor. Or maybe it was from the war they'd have to prepare for. He excitedly looked at the sky and felt it was a mixture of all three. Later, they fought again when Cordry approached him and seemed like a monster and a true predator. Cordry informs the Arthur that he is coming, so he should be prepared. Arthur gets into his position and starts attacking him as soon as he reaches close to him. He curses his fortune because no matter how hard he tries, he fails to land even a single strike, instead get attacked again. Over a month had passed in the outside world, which means about a year had passed in this parallel world. The Arthur looks behind to find his instructor, but is startled as he isn't there. He appears from another direction, hurriedly attacking him. Cordry appraised the Arthur as his movements improved, even with his aura's suppression. He attacked Arthur, which he tried to block, but was pushed back by his tremendous force. While trembling, he still didn't lose hope and rushed to attack his master. But on his way, his body couldn't bear to move further, and he knelt. Cordry applauded him as his performance wasn't bad. His master returned to his usual self, and Arthur lay on the ground and asked his master how long he had lasted with King's force this time. Cordry assured him that he was improving, which made the Arthur think that he might not be able to last long enough. But his master didn't want him to dwell in seconds and instructed him to stand again. But he shouldn't use any weapon this time. Cordry knew that Arthur preferred sword fighting, and he wanted to say that Dawn Ballad was a fine partner. However, as a mage, hand-to-hand combat remains the most versatile and adaptive form of fighting. For the sake of the coming war, he wanted to mold Arthur's bones, develop his muscles, and train his mind to its limit so that he would become the knight who protected his continents and his loved ones. His master knew the Arthur had impressive training in melee combat, but this fighting style is more suited for dueling against a single opponent. Since Asuras are not allowed to partake in this war, their descendants and the mixed blood will be their most potent forces. Cordry wants him to expect to be in a situation where he will be surrounded by enemies with Asura's blood coursing through them. The restriction of mana usage placed on Arthur will help him learn precise mana usage. When it comes down to mana, physical combat augmented with proper and accurate mana usage will be the most efficient and dependable way of disposing of his enemies. The Arthur understands his master's instructions and gets into his combat position. Cordry approaches him and says that the first lesson he taught Arthur was how to stay alive and fight and dodge at higher speeds. So, the Arthur's lesson after that is fighting under conditions of substantial pressure. Thus, combating the effect of Cordry King Force, or killing intent as he calls it, strengthened his tolerance considerably these past few months. But now it was the turn for his third field of focus lesson, in which his field of vision needed to be narrower and more focused. Cordry immediately rushed behind the Arthur, trying to attack, but Arthur noticed his presence behind him and immediately punched him. His master was impressed by Arthur's punch, which was a nice one, but when he again tried to punch him, his master easily dodged it. His instructor inquired how much strength he supposed he used to release a strike of that power, and if he was confident that he could do that for 2 or 3 days straight. He taught him that proper conservation and distribution of mana in prolonged battles is essential, but the same goes for the person's body. He grabbed Arthur's hand and said that mana was like a sword, a tool for him to control and utilize. His body is the centerpiece that brings the tools together to create a true warrior, and he bends Arthur's arm, hits his spine, and instructs him to defend himself with mana as he allows it. Cordry pushed the Arthur while ejecting a tremendous amount of mana that Arthur tried to tolerate for the time being, but soon, being unable to bear it, it pierced through his body, and he shouted with pain. Soon, he came out of the pond and held his head, and his master stood before him, looking at his pitiful state. Cordry was startled as he looked to the other side where his other student was standing, which delighted him as he finally arrived. The Arthur was stunned, wondering whom his master was talking to, and astounded to see a guy greeting him. The boy named Tasai apologized to his master Cordry for his tardiness. He was startled as he looked at Arthur sitting in the pond, but then turned back. The Arthur comes out of the lake and asks his master about the boy. Cordry introduces his apprentice, Tasai, his new training partner, shocking them both. Tasai was more surprised to know that he would be a partner of such a lesser being, as he thought his master wanted him to come there so he could finally get a chance to receive some individual training. Cordry assured Tasai that he would be training while he sparred with Arthur, so he instructed him to come there so they could begin. Tasai made a strange face and inquired his master what benefit would come from training with this lesser being. Cordry explained that Arthur has been receiving special training from him, so Tassai has been given the rare honor of training the Ether Orb, yet he dared to complain to his mother. Tassai refused and explained that his pupil only thought it was beneath his master to waste his time training a mere human when the Thyists clan had many pupils awaiting his mentorship. Cordry sighed, looked at the Arthur, and uttered that the members of the Pantheon race all differ in their utilization of skill. What they call force-type mana, increasing their attacks and area of influence, and his apprentice Tassai has been training in the unique arts of the Thyists clan. They can adequately match their attacks by perceiving where the opponent distributes their weight and momentum to take advantage of their strength. Doing this, they use little effort to dispel their attacks and conserve their strength for when they attack. Cordry has shown him only a glimpse of this Arthur, but he wants him to train it by fighting against Tassai. He instructed Tassai to use his full strength to fight against Arthur and not worry about fatal injuries or death. He instructed Arthur not to use any mana as he had to block and deflect, and the only form of offensive maneuvers he was permitted were thrown. This shocked Tassai as this doesn't make sense because he should be restricting him instead of the human. Cordry got tired of his pupil Tassai continuously whining and inquired if he doubted his master's judgment, which embarrassed Tassai, and he refused, saying he didn't doubt him. Since both agreed and he thoroughly instructed them, he decided to begin the match. They enter the grassland where Tassai is trying to kick the Arthur. Despite several attempts to attack Arthur using a different style, he fails. This infuriated him, so he gave a hard blow to the human boy and rushed to attack him but again failed. Their master was supervising their match. While only 7 years of age, Tassai displayed an unusual amount of talent from the beginning, enough to catch the eye of the clan elders. Yet after only a few days, and with all of the restrictions placed, Arthur slowly began to keep up. His steps, shifts, and movements were all becoming faster and sharper, as if his body instinctively pared away unnecessary movements. Cordry couldn't believe this and wondered how this was possible. He wondered how many people had fought to develop this aberrant level of perception. In Cordry's years of experience as a warrior and a mentor, he nurtured pupils who later became leading figures in the Thyists clan. Still, while training this boy, Arthur introduced him to a sensation he had never felt before. After several attempts, Tassai finally landed a blow on Arthur, which he managed to block, but because of a considerable force, he was pushed back and stood firm. On the contrary, Cordry was astounded as he did not even feel emotions like excitement, awe, and pride toward himself, which continued to well up because of Arthur. There was no telling what he would become, and his longing to find out was exhilarating. He wondered if Arthur had been born in Assyria, he would have been a prominent member of even the highest power echelons. The Arthur grabbed Tika's fist while being attacked and threw him back forcefully and furiously. Cordry was gloomy and felt pity as God had positioned Arthur to merely be a pawn who could be utilized until he was no longer needed. After some time, during their combat training, the Arthur is attacked by Tassai, but he overextends his punch, which helps Arthur duck under and move in. He rushed further away, where another opponent was waiting for him. She tried to kick Arthur, but her kick was too high, and she was off balance, so he decided to exploit that. Thus, evading her kick, he grabbed her other leg and pulled her down. Next was the third opponent, Turn, rushing at him. But Arthur found the gap in his attack as the boy's left hook was thrown prematurely, so he leaned his head back an inch and evaded his attack. Then, all four decide to attack the Arthur simultaneously without giving him any loose ends to evade the attack. He noticed that the strike was coming toward the face, and another kick was aimed at the ribs. He was astounded as their attacks became more coordinated. But with a few swings of his body and a few swift movements, he managed to evade their attack. Then Tassai and his comrade decided to kick Arthur simultaneously, and the Arthur planned to lower his body to dodge the kick aimed at his head and block the one aimed at the ribs. Thus, he used the force of the kick to push away from the current disadvantageous position. They assumed he might be their target now, so they rushed to attack him, but their time was up before they could land a blow. This made all of them furious as they were close enough and started complaining to their master, assuring him they could have had him if their master had given them one more minute. Cordry instructed them to quiet down as it was enough argument, as there were 4 against 1, and they still complained after being unable to land a single, solid hit on Arthur. He asked Arthur how he felt now, and the Arthur stretched his wrist and said he never felt this better. After that, the Arthur rushes to punch Cordry, but he grasps his punch, and after that, he fights Tasai and all of them. About 4 months had passed in the outside world, meaning he had trained in the soul realm for nearly 4 years because of the ether orb. Although his body had barely aged physiologically, it had gained years of muscle memory and core levels under the tutelage of Cordry. He had recently passed his 14th birthday. Just as any other day, he had spent honing his body, reflexes, and understanding of combat. He continuously fought all of them, and after a long duration of training, they were all exhausted, so they decided to rest for a while. The Arthur, Master Cordry, also helped him refine his mana to aid in combat, but he hadn't taught him anything new conceptually. He wasn't sure if it was because of the physiological differences between humans and asuras, or his master didn't want to or wasn't allowed to pass on the Thiast's clan mana arts to non-clan members. The Arthur trusted Cordry and absorbed whatever he taught instead of their peculiar skills. Later, he came out of the realm of soul and thanked them all for helping him train. But they didn't like him, so they all turned their faces away, and Tasai was furiously staring at him, making Arthur gloomy. The Arthur thanked his master, Cordry, for training him until now. His master smiled and commented that it was also a treat for him. The Arthur stretches his arm to relax and asks when the next portion of their training is. But both of them were sad, which startled Arthur, and he wondered if everything was all right. Elder Winsome affirmed and uttered that they would start the next portion of training soon. It was just that Arthur had not changed. This concerned him, and he wondered what they meant by that he hadn't changed. His mana core has advanced into the latter levels of light yellow, which is almost at the complete stage. Elder Winsome explained that training under the ether orb could be tremendously beneficial, and is strictly forbidden for use on children for prolonged periods. The time discrepancy between the two realms can cause psychological displacement if a person is not yet fully developed mentally. So, even Lords Indrath and Cordry hesitated to use it with the Arthur, but the impending war gave them no choice. Yet Arthur's speech, demeanor, and mentality were no different from before the training began. Although his mind has aged 3 years during training there, he has not displayed any changes an average child should have undergone. The Arthur explained that he has been advanced for his age and mentality his whole life and has grown accustomed to presenting himself as such. Becoming a professor at Xyrus to educate students his age helped with that. This relaxed Elder Winsome, as this was all the better for them and Arthur's training. Elder Winsome also thanked Cordry for his help and knew that anyone else, even among the Asuras, would be subpar compared to his expertise in close quarters combat. But Cordry doesn't need to say thanks, as he knows that Arthur must be well trained to have a chance against those mutts. He put his hand on the Arthur's shoulder and reminded him that the mages in Alakria have been taught and guided by Asuras. Mana arts on that continent are generations more advanced than they are in Dickathon, and it frustrates him deeply that their hands are tied like this. But breaking the pact could result in a war that would destroy the world itself, and if they didn't want that, it was up to Arthur and his peers to fight them. The Arthur bid farewell to them and left. On his way, Elder W&D Som gave him a scroll. He opened it, read it, and was worried. After reading the scroll, they have been covering their journey quietly when the Arthur breaks the silence. He asks the Elder if the information the director gave that Cynthia Goodsky provided them with these so-called 4 sides is his target, as he assumes it is that way. The Elder explained that, as per the letter, they had learned that each of the 4 sides also has a retainer. They are a personal aid and direct subordinate, each capable of quickly dispatching a lance. 4 more were at a level even above them, and they drew a conclusion based on the horn fragment collected from the dungeon where Lance Elia had been killed. But Goodsky had confirmed that it belonged to prime blood of the retainer level, and this captured Arthur's attention as he thought Director Goodsky was under a bind that prevented her from revealing information. Elder ignored this and kept going, which startled Arthur, and he assumed that the one responsible for killing Elia was what they call a retainer and not a scythe. The scale of this upcoming war is when 2 continents send millions of soldiers to fight for their land. Dickathon and his family are currently safe, but he wonders how long it will be kept going with the strength of Ritra. He denies it because at least now he finally has a goal, which is a solid number of enemies to work with, and he has his targets. Finally, they reach the cliff, where the Elder informed him that this was where he would be training next. The Arthur was pissed off to know about this, and Elder Winsome instructed him to remember what he told him about his next training. The Arthur rambled that he couldn't use anything except for the items in his bag, and he couldn't use external mana arts. Which was correct, so Winsome handed him a bag and supposed he understood what he needed to obtain to complete his mission. He needed the pelt of a raptor squirrel, the beast core of a silver panther, and the claws of a titan bear. These items will prove somehow that Arthur is ready to learn more about the will that Sylvia left him. Elder Winsome remembered that there was one more condition, and he handed him a bell and instructed him to wear it all the time. He asked the Arthur to tell him by breaking the bell when he had collected all the items on the list, and he recommended that he retrieve them in that order. This irritated the Arthur, and he had questions about his training method, which was quite bizarre. He furiously grabbed his head and then went to the cliff end. He grabbed the straps of his bag, sighed, and jumped down the cliff. Down the cliff, the raptor's squirrels were eating the nuts. As soon as the Arthur slammed down, the squirrels got scared and rushed away. The Arthur cursed the bell that he was wearing because, with his every movement, the bell rang, which pissed him off. He stood and moved away in search of his target, and he started peeking in the bushes to search those raptor squirrels. After observing the raptor squirrels for a few days, he learned that the bell wasn't the only thing alerting them about his presence. Although the bell didn't help him, he discovered they were also susceptible to his mana. Raptor squirrels were at the bottom of the food chain and had developed extremely acute senses to compensate for their lack of physical strength. Hiding his presence wasn't enough to lure them, so he had to figure something else out first. He decided to figure out how to catch that squirrel later, but first, he had to get close to them. He tried to withdraw all of the mana continuously circulating in his body, thus leaving his body unprotected in these unfamiliar grounds, which was the risk he had to take. However, it wasn't enough to retract his mana, and he kept doing this. Soon, Arthur realized it was also indispensable to clear his mind and intent when dealing with prey animals. After several hours of hard work, he exhaled and slightly opened his eyes. He saw a raptor squirrel sniffing and quickly came out of the bush, which delighted the Arthur, but as soon as his face appeared from the bushes, the squirrel rushed away. This made him gloomy as everything he planned was easier said than done. And it took a few more days, but he kept testing their limits and learned 3 things. First, leaking even a bit of purified mana didn't necessarily drive them away, but alarmed them to the degree that it would be impossible to catch one. The second interesting thing he learned was that internalizing mana inside his body did not trigger their alarm signal. But too much concentration and focus forced his intent to bleed out, causing them to scatter. The last thing that the Arthur learned, and perhaps the most useful, was that external mana flow did not startle, or even prompt them to take notice. He again prepared the meal for that raptor squirrel and sat down, trying to retract his mana and killing intent to attract them. As an augmenter, the mana channels responsible for spreading purified mana from his core throughout the rest of his body were more prominent than his mana veins, which were used to absorb unpurified atmospheric mana into the body. However, this technique balances the output of purified mana from his mana core through his mana channel and the input of atmospheric mana through his veins. It has been years since Sylvia taught Arthur mana rotation for the first time. He remembered that Sylvia instructed him to meditate and absorb mana while moving and perhaps while fighting if he was good at this. Now, he could use mana rotatory almost unconsciously, which would help him with this new technique. With a perfect balance, he could utilize mana without anyone or anything being able to sense that he was doing so. Finally, when he opened his eyes, he saw the raptor squirrel eating the mushrooms he used to lure them. He was so delighted to succeed that he shouted happily, chasing those squirrels away. At night, he was concerned that having to resupply his mana core every few minutes slowed down his progress. But he guessed he couldn't help it. It had been many days that he had been there, and he could still barely move while maintaining the technique with that stupid bell. Before going to sleep, he had so many thoughts roaming in his head, and he wondered if Sylvie was doing any better with her training, how his family was doing, and how his sister was. But he wanted to focus on training, so he decided to jolt away all the unnecessary thoughts that would be hindrances on his way, as that was the only way he could get back to them. The following day he marked the line and went to the opposite side, where he created a starting point. He wanted to be able to use mana in bursts and ponce on the raptor squirrels before they could react to the sound of his bell. Arthur Lewin knew that he needed to reach the tree by the time the bell chimes, and to do this, he needed to utilize enough mana to instantaneously move at a speed faster enough not to shake the bell. At the same time, he balanced the input and output of atmospheric mana and his purified mana to camouflage his presence for the raptor's squirrel tail until he arrived at the location. He tried multiple times, but his bell continued chiming after covering a few distances, which irritated and stressed him out. He recalled that his master Cordry stressed that controlling mana flow and power while manipulating his presence to hide or emit was critical to throwing off his opponent's sense. For this, he needs to erase his presence by using the barely traceable atmospheric mana to mask the output of his mana and instantly gain speed to reach his opponent. The Arthur wondered if that was the skill that Winsome was trying to test, so he tried multiple times, yet he left some traces. After some time, the Arthur sighed and enthusiastically stared at the point he marked before him. Elder Winsome, looking at him above the cliff, wondered what that boy was planning. It had already been 2 weeks, and he assumed he had too much faith in Arthur, but thought Arthur would have been able to catch a squirrel by now. Elder Winsome looked at the squirrel and was astounded as he knew their tails could sense any mana fluctuation or movement in the area, but they are simple-minded. Elder Winsome thought that all that human kid had to do was erase his presence and stay motionless with some bait in his hand. But he was delighted as Arthur grasped the skill he intended to learn, and he was stunned as he saw Arthur approaching those squirrels. After some time, he reached close to them and grabbed one of the squirrels who was busy eating the bait he had prepared. Elder Winsome was dumbfounded as Arthur had just completed the first step of the Mirage Walk. For a mere human boy to grasp the fundamentals of Mirage Walk was quite unbelievable. The essence of what makes the Theists clan reign supreme over all other clans concerning physical combat is this skill. He can't believe Arthur could get this far just by watching Cordry. He wonders how much that kid will achieve in the next 10 or 5 years. Later, the Arthur observes the Silver Panther attack the squirrel, and when he finds the right time, he rushes to attack him. But that Silver Panther dodged his attack and fled away. Arthur chased him, but in the end, he reached the cliff near the lake. He furiously slammed the tree and cursed his fortune as he missed him again. Winsome found him that first night after he had caught the raptor squirrel and informed him that what he had done to catch the squirrel was an introductory step to the actual essence of Mirage Walk. After that, it took him 3 weeks to trek deeper into the forest before he found the Silver Panther he had deemed his target clawed. Arthur had become proficient at the burst step to the point where he could clear almost 10 yards instantly without triggering the bell. But despite that, he wasn't any closer to catching Claude. He looked at his reflection in the water and remarked that he was not easy to look at. He washed his face and looked above where the squirrel was eating the nut at the tree branch. His stomach started growling out of hunger, and he couldn't even remember the last time he ate. He devised to capture the squirrel, but was startled as he saw the bird approaching it, making all the noise. Soon, it successfully captured the squirrel, flew away, and started eating it on another tree branch, leaving Arthur speechless. Arthur was astounded as that bird calculated the squirrel's movements and predicted where it would jump. The Arthur thinks for a while, but suddenly, he hears the noise of another squirrel, which also captures the bird's attention. Soon after, it rushed toward it without giving it the time to understand the situation. The bird grasped its neck with his claw. The Arthur rushed to capture that bird, but it flew away before he could lay his hand on it. The Arthur could only capture its few feathers and realized that his burst step still had a way to go. After this, he observed the bird for a week and discovered that they were stealthy and swift, but their speed couldn't compare to that of a raptor squirrel. Arthur knew that when it made itself known, the squirrel would try to fly in a particular direction if they manipulated the movements of their prey instead. As a third-party spectator, he could see the bird beforehand and knew immediately its motives even before it attacked. Something the squirrel had no way of knowing, but the panthers were different from the squirrels. Claude was smart enough to realize he could evade Arthur's attacks but not fight him face to face. Even though the essence of Mirage Walk was to conceal mana to throw off the opponent completely, the Arthur still had to move the muscles responsible for making that one swift step. Although this trick might work for the squirrels, it gave just enough time for Claude to evade him. This is why he always gets away from his grasp, so the Arthur thinks about what would happen if he could almost entirely eliminate the motion needed to make that step. If the Arthur succeeds in doing this, it would appear as if he had truly teleported, and theoretically, he could feint Claude. From Arthur's past life, he learned that the body's intricate muscular system worked in pairs, each responsible for half of a complete movement. The bicep flexed when the arm curled toward the shoulder, while the triceps activated when the arm straightened out. The abdominal muscles contracted with each forward step the body took, and the calf muscles were crucial. Despite their smaller size, they propelled the body forward as the foot was pushed off the ground. The body mechanism was even more complex when the body was put into motion, such as walking, running, or jumping. The knowledge of the body that he had retained from his previous life wasn't valuable until now. However, he had to remember that while training to acquire his current target, so he marked the line and placed his bag at a certain distance, then jumped from the starting point, trying to reach the point without using his muscles. The Arthur had been working toward a conscious and deliberate manipulation of mana into specific muscle in a particular progression with precise timing, to artificially trigger a sequence in his body that mimics muscle use without needing to move his body. He knew that if he could control the timing and mana output perfectly, he would be capable of something even his master Cordry couldn't do. He could execute Mirage Walk-In, but was not limited to standing, so he tried hard to accomplish this, forcing himself to work hard and wondering how long he would spend catching wild animals there. Later, he headed inside and was alarmed to see that the forest was so quiet that day, and he hadn't even seen a single squirrel, which was weird. He heard some noise, so he looked behind, went to the location, and hid in the bushes. Down there, he saw two panthers prepared to fight each other. The Arthur is amazed to see the territorial fight between the two silver panthers and realizes why the forest is empty. One of the silver panthers was injured, yet he rushed to attack the other silver panther. However, he failed because of his opponent's swift movements and got struck in his face instead. The Arthur is shocked to see this, and the silver panther is startled as he hears the noise coming down the cliff, so it turns and looks there and gets worried about learning who did this. The Arthur sees this being concealed in bushes on the other side. Taking advantage of his opponent's distraction, one of the silver panthers rushes away out of fear. The Arthur was stunned and wondered why the Claude ran away like that when he was the one winning the fight. He looked at the injured panther, assuming it might be his only chance, so he closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. After the mana surged in his body, he opened his eyes and rushed toward the Claude. He grabbed it by his neck, yet Silver Panther was so brazen that he managed to escape his grasp and tried to evade it. After several attempts, the Arthur could finally grasp it, but he got attacked by Panther's claw. Silver Panther was scratching the Arthur's body, yet he wasn't giving up. They reached the cliff where the Silver Panther roared, and they both fell. The Arthur uses his mana and apologizes to Elder Winsome for breaking the rule, hoping he will understand this situation. Thus, he safely managed to reach down, and he coughed because of the dust that gathered due to the fall of Silver Panther. Suddenly, the Arthur felt a strong vibration as someone approached him, and the unbearable stench made it difficult for him to breathe. He was shocked as he looked ahead and saw the Titan bear standing before him. The Arthur's eyes spread out of shock as he saw the Titan bear because his size was so small, utterly different from what he was expecting. He assumed that it might be just a cub, and the Titan bear reached near the dead Silver Panther. Laying its claws on Silver Panther, it clarified that this meal was not going anywhere as it was fresh. The Arthur is dumbfounded to discover that Titan bear can talk, as Winston doesn't mention anything about them talking. Titan Bear furiously stares at the Arthur and remarks that he will start eating with him first. The Titan Bear growled furiously and attacked the Arthur using his mana, which threw him back and shocked him, and he wondered what that skill was. The bear swished his claw in the air, thus creating sharp waves of attacks, but Arthur evaded all those attacks. But one of the attacks pierced through his leg, and therefore, the blood spurted out of it. The bear rushed toward him angrily as he was a challenging meal. The bear attacks the Arthur again, which he evades, but it inflicts minor injuries on him, and the bear wonders how he is doing that. Without giving a break, Titan Bear threw several sharp slashes to attack him, thus piercing through the Arthur's chest even after dodging them. The Arthur was struck by a sudden substantial wave of energy that pushed him to the rock, and he got slammed hard and coughed out blood. The Arthur was concerned that this wasn't the realm of the soul, so if he died there, he would die for real. Titan Bear approached the Arthur and inquired if he was done with all of his tricks and acting hard to get. The Arthur swings his legs, thus blocking the vision through the dust, and rushes away. He knew that when the bear slashed with his paw, the resulting attacks were also a sharp slash. Titan Bear remarked that the more Arthur tries to avoid him, the more painful this will be for him, and the less of him will be left to eat. The Arthur raised his hand and assured the bear that he wouldn't run anymore, and the forceful blow of the bear again attacked him. The Arthur knew that when the bear punched, it caused a blunt force attack. He wanted to finish this bear quickly because his legs wouldn't last longer due to injuries. He stared at the bear furiously as if he hadn't fought through 2 lives to die in a ditch at the claws of a wild animal. The Arthur rushed and reached behind him, and after his bell chimed, it captured the bear's attention, and he looked behind and attacked. This broke his bell into 2 pieces and split it, and it stunned Titan Bear as Arthur wasn't there. The Arthur reached behind him and then quickly rushed before him, punching straight at his abdomen. His single strike was so forceful that it slammed the bear with the rocks behind and killed it. After this, the Arthur falls on the ground, is excessively bleeding, and gets unconscious. After some time, Elder Winsome reached there and wondered why Arthur would come all the way down there. He was startled as he saw Arthur lying unconscious on one side, and the Titan Bear cub did at the corner. He immediately rushed toward the Arthur, trying to heal him. He found out that his 3 ribs were broken. He had many deep gashes in his chest, and his legs had internal bleeding. He was astounded to know that all of this damage was caused by a cub because a full-grown bear standing at 10 feet tall would not have been able to cause this much devastation. He was stunned as he saw the bear's claws, which were red and had several prominent veins. Winsome lifted the corpse of the bear, trying to pull out something from its body, and found a demon leech inside his body. He was amazed as this was a scarce specimen that was, as intelligent as it was, foul and native only to Ephiodus. This demon leech can possess the host body and strengthen the host core to a fantastic degree, which would be deadly to even an Asura. He recalled that Agrona himself experimented on them to create the strengthening serum given to Decathians during the Xyrus attack. He grabbed the leech, pulled it out, and wondered if it was bad luck or irony that Arthur ran into this possessed cub. He crushed the leech, got its core, and was amazed as Arthur defeated the possessed. He feeds that pill to the Arthur and remarks that his difficulties have paid off tremendously. Later, the Arthur becomes conscious and lies on the bed, wondering where he is. He tried to sit, but was unable to move his legs and couldn't feel it. So he took off the blanket and saw his feet bandaged. Abruptly, an old lady appeared and assured him that his legs were fine, so he shouldn't worry, and she wished they could have met under better circumstances. The lady came near him and gave him some medication to drink, and the Arthur inquired her if they were still in Ephiodus. The lady instructed him to call her Meyer and affirmed as they were in Ephiodus. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to mend the pitiful state of his leg anywhere else. Using healing mana arts could help his legs heal faster, but it would have caused his bones to take on an entirely different shape. It has been 2 days since he has been lying like this, yet it would take some time to heal it properly. The Arthur was so shocked that he almost spit out the medicine, put the mug on the side table, and inquired if it had been 2 days. He was trying to leave when Meyer stopped him and instructed him not to try to get up for that night, as it took hours to get his legs knit back together into something resembling functional appendages. So, he needs to rest and stand on his limb again, and it should be his most significant priority for now. Arthur thanked Meyer for treating him and expressed his hearty gratitude for her hostility. But she doesn't want him to bother with thanking her because she doesn't treat just anyone. She wanted to meet the human boy who would supposedly become the world's savior, so she treated him the same way she would treat him. After instructing and giving him the medicine, she left, and the Arthur suddenly felt excruciating pain. He assumed he might meditate to try and heal faster, so he closed his eyes and was startled when he felt something strange about his core. His core has turned into silver, after which all the symbols on his body are enlightened, and tremendous energy emits out of his body. He was shocked as he was able to see different particles in the air. Out of these, he hadn't ever seen these purple specks before. Those purple specks landed on his arm, further enlightening it, and soon he gave up as he got so exhausted that he stopped meditation. Meyer appeared and was surprised to know that rumors were true, as Arthur had inherited Realm's heart. The Arthur had never heard about Realm Heart, and the lady explained the physical manifestations he displayed when he tapped into Sylvia's power. The iris was glowing purple, and she saw those unmistakable glowing runes imprinted on his body, all pointing toward it. Realm Heart, or the Realm Heart physique, is an ability only the Indrath bloodline could possess. She asked the Arthur if he could see all 5 colors that make up the physical realm, and he affirmed. She put the cup on the side table and explained that the Indrath clan ancestors named the Realm Heart physiques. In this state, the user's attunement to the physical realm is said to be unparalleled, while the ability does not offer much strength in and of itself. The power to activate Realm Heart allows the user to gain knowledge and insight, which those without it could never hope to achieve, which is to say that knowledge truly is power. The Arthur uttered that when he used the second phase, Realm Heart, last time, he could only see 4 colors and inquired why he could only now see the purple particles. He wonders if this is one of the secrets that a lesser being like him can't know, and the lady thinks for a while. She explained that Asuras are prideful beings indeed, and even amongst other members of their race, they remain secretive and greedy, specifically the Indrath clan. She doesn't want to say that she is very different from them, but she has lived long enough and experienced far too much to care about such frivolousness. She adjusted his leg to a suitable position and said she could happily teach Arthur a thing or two so he could handle a little stroll. Later, she took him out of the room and into these eye-catching places that amazed the Arthur. She asked if he found his place quite beautiful and uttered that all these creatures thrive on the raw mana that was relatively plentiful in this part of Ephesus and was certain that he would feel it, too. It wasn't natural for lesser beings or even Asuras to manipulate raw mana, and it's the same for all living creatures, even for mana beasts. The Arthur is playing with the firefly when Meyer explains that mages with an affinity to a particular element have a much easier time absorbing the atmospheric mana that coincides with that element. She gives the example of a firebug, which was exposed to all the mana in its world, but naturally took in the mana particles that its body is most inclined toward, and the same is true for the mages. To someone with a Realm Heart physiques, a fire affinity mage would appear to be absorbing only the red mana particles. However, upon completion of the refining process, the mana would appear white when first used. If the mage's affinity is water, then during the process of refining the raw mana, the amount of water element his body will absorb will be disproportionately more significant than the other element. While the mage refines the water elemental mana his body absorbs, the raw alters his body to become more predisposed and his mind to become more insightful of that particular element. If the mage were to execute a fireball, this water affinity mage undoubtedly has to concentrate hard on the shape, proportion, density, and even the speed to launch it. However, the same mage will have no trouble raising a stream of water, separating it into multiple orbs, and casting it to barrage an enemy with just a flick of his wrist. She questioned Arthur about why he thought this was, and he replied that it was because of the influence that absorbing a majority of the water element had on the mage during the refining process, which was the correct answer. She further explained that after exposure to a particular element for so long, the mage would undoubtedly gain insight during meditation. They reached the table, and she sat next to him. While having a cup of tea, she asked Arthur if he could tell her what he knew about ether. He doesn't know much about it, but knows it can manipulate time. Meyer described that ether is fundamentally different from mana, which is evident to everyone. Still, both entities make up their world, but ether works very differently than mana. She poured some water into the glass and uttered that some people have speculated that ether makes up the building blocks the world is made of, while mana is what fills it with life and sustenance. In simple words, ether could be the cup, and the mana is the water that fills it. It is quite easy to manipulate the water inside without mana, but much more difficult to change the shape of the cup without breaking it. Even the Indrath clan, hailed as the most adept in utilizing ether, has no solid theory to justify what they can do. What they do have, which no one else has, is the ability to physically detect ether through the use of the Realm Heart physique. She poured some water from the glass and continued explaining that those in the physical realm cannot sense ether. Everyone knows some laws hold their world together just as that glass holds the water, but it's impossible for them to fathom the boundaries that exist to keep order in the world. The Arthur inquired if the purple particles he had just seen after using the Realm Heart were ether, and she affirmed. Through the use of Realm Heart, he could see the glass cup from within the boundaries of this world. Meyer further described that for the mana, the greater the capacity of his core, the more water he could manipulate. However, through influencing Ether, they could control the cup itself and asked him if he understood what she meant, and Arthur nodded his head to affirm. Then, she progressed further and told him about the three components that make up Ether. The first is the control over time, evum. The second is the authority over space, spatium. And the last one, which influences all living components, is vuvum. No matter how powerful, insightful, or lucky a practitioner may be, he can only master one path. However, over time, they discovered a way for some asuras to discern where their aptitude lies. The Arthur gets curious and inquires how. Hearing this, Meyer smirks. Her body emits mana, and her imprinted runes are enlightened. She explained that by the runes that appear on the body when using Realm Heart. Meyer explained that the runes are different for each Realm Heart user, but these markings show that she is on the Vivum path, which is why she was able to heal Arthur. So she instructed Arthur to activate his Realm Heart, and he closed his eyes and activated his runes. She left her seat and went close to the Arthur since she could get a glimpse of what his runes looked like earlier, but on seeing it closely, they were genuinely fascinating. The Arthur lifted his hand, and with the flicker of his fingers, he used several different kinds of magic, which stunned him as he never noticed this before. Meyer was amazed, and he was having fun after learning about his powers. She doesn't blame him for not realizing that this form was meant to observe and study what cannot usually be perceived as he was human. She explained that Ether behaves fundamentally differently from mana, and would only be met with failure if he tried to manipulate Ether as he had done with mana. She lifted her hand, used the magic, and again gave him the example of a cup of water from which he could drink, gargle, and spit water out as long as he knew how, but he would be a fool if he tried the same thing with the cup. Although Ether is present all around them yet, it is the very boundary that confines Arthur and her to the limits they have. Vivum, which influenced all living components, is the power she used to piece back together Arthur's shattered legs. He was shocked as she easily manipulated those particles and treated his legs, so he rambled several questions simultaneously with shock. He wondered how she gathered Ether in her hand and how that formed into Vivum and healed his legs. This surprised Meyer, and she instructed him to slow down. She uttered that after learning that her affinity lay with the branch of life, she studied Vivum for centuries. Even so, she was not confident she could explain to him what the Arthur truly wished to know. The Arthur was still stubborn and wanted to learn about this, which impressed Meyer, and she praised him and started explaining. The first thing Arthur needs to know is that, unlike mana, he cannot absorb Ether, as he can barely change its presence and influence on reality. This startled Arthur, and he questioned if this meant that a core wasn't needed to influence Ether. She explained that an individual core is what connects the body to the physical realm. While Ether isn't directly manipulated in the way that mana is, the mana cores are crucial. She was sure that Arthur would realize his path when the time came, but she didn't want to let him be overwhelmed as he was in the beginning stages of his cultivation. She wants him to remember that after a certain point, his cultivation will no longer depend on his rote ability to refine mana, but instead on gaining insight into knowledge that cannot be passed down. Meyer was unsure if this was mere coincidence or fate, but there was a reason why he had the ability, which is as limited as it is to utilize Ether, and inquired if he could guess what that ability was. The Arthur guessed it was because of Sylvia's will. She agreed that was partly the reason that Arthur was able to bear the burden of Ether, but that wasn't the reason he was able to manipulate it. The Arthur clenched his fist and pondered to figure out the reason. He suddenly understood the concept and shouted in shock because he could manipulate all four elements. That was the precise answer that Meyer wanted to hear, and uttered that it was the insight into all four of the fundamental elements that allowed them to take a look beyond the water and become aware of the glass cup they were held in. Meyer was startled as she noted Arthur's hand was trembling because he had been holding it for too long, and she instructed him to release Realm Heart, as he was impressive to be able to last this long. He realized the Realm Heart, after which all his runes disappeared, and he took a peaceful breath. While taking the glass of water, he asked Meyer if she was able to tell him which quality of Ether he was best suited for. She sighed and warned Arthur that she could not predict whether or not he would be able to consciously control Ether like asuras can. Although he possesses the ability to manipulate all four elements and has gained both a dragon's will and the Realm Heart physique, he is still a human. The Arthur angrily clenched his teeth and turned as he understood what she meant, but Meyer wanted to tell him one thing. She wrote something on paper and wasn't sure why Arthur was able to manipulate time, but he was never meant to go down the path of evil. He was also unable to fully grasp Etha's manipulation despite Sylvia's will, which was why, like Sylvia, he was meant to control the very fabric of the boundaries that keep the physical realm in place. After drawing something on it, she slid the paper toward Arthur and uttered that he was of spatium genus. Arthur was reluctant, as Meyer had said, regardless of this knowledge. But it was still possible that he couldn't control this ability consciously. The Arthur urged Meyer to tell him what he needed to do. Till now, all he knew about this grand ability was that he qualified for it. But because of the physical limitations of the species, he assumed he wouldn't be able to handle the burden. She lovingly patted his shoulder and pitied him as he had such an overwhelming potential for greatness, but his capacity was hindered by something he could not control. She didn't tell him this to mick him, but to remind him that he has this ability at his disposal. Knowledge was an immeasurable strength, and with it, Arthur may find a way past the boundaries of his birth, which is something even the Asuras do not yet see. She has broken many rules by imparting all this knowledge to him, and she is confident that this knowledge can certainly be used against the dragon race if it falls into the wrong hands. She urges him to believe her when she says this because she genuinely wants what is best for him. She assures him that even if the real heart cannot be utilized fully, it can be an incomparable asset in the coming battles because of its sensory functions. So, with Realm Heart and Arthur's ability to manipulate all four elements and his remarkable combat prowess, she was certain he had many tools at his disposal. The Arthur was still unconfident, and Meyer uttered that Arthur's had created this movement technique and the one who had brought him into her home in such a horrid state. It could not be one of them, so she instructed him not to use that skill again, which saddened him that all those weeks of training and refining burst steps were for nothing. She asked him how Mirage Walk worked and was surprised at how he taught himself. After learning about its mechanics, the Arthur hoped that she would change her mind, but it became clear that the moves were dangerous. The Arthur's breakthrough into the Silver Core stage was a pleasant surprise. Furthermore, his combat with Cordry would place him easily into the All class as an adventurer, even without using elemental magic. Now, he had little to show in terms of improvement in the magic of mana arts. The Mirage Walk was the only technique he had managed to piece together, but now that was gone. Actual Asuras were residing in Alakria, and their levels of mana manipulation were probably beyond what he could imagine. According to winsome reports, there was a single retainer who was capable of wiping out a team led by a lance. Although Meyer insisted that knowledge is power, it wouldn't help him defeat Alakria. Meyer was waiting for him outside the home the next day, and he wobbled out with his injured legs. As she anticipated, Arthur had a hard night with the use of Vivum. He felt worse than when his legs got damaged, but at least he was able to walk now. This was good for him because she had asked Winsome for some time with him, and she activated her Realm Heart and stared at him. That time can be short or long, depending on what he achieved for the duration, as she wanted to share some of her knowledge with him and nudge him in the right direction. But Arthur is still human, and the inhabitants of Dicathan are far behind in their insight on mana. She instructed Arthur to consider every magical spell he knew, use whichever combination he liked, and hit her with all he had. The Arthur affirmed, lifted his hand, and started preparing magic to attack her. The Arthur was shocked as Meyer predicted that he was preparing a compressed water sphere in his right palm, while his left hand would shoot a small gust of wind. She instructed him as she already told Arthur that he should hit her with all he had. The Arthur grinned, and Meyer slammed her foot on the ground, thus creating an overlapping radius around both of them, helping her read his skill. She uttered that Arthur was planning on rupturing the ground under her, which was a clever idea, but she preferred that he wouldn't ruin the grass. This shocked the Arthur, and he wondered how she was doing this and how he was finding out his moves. Meyer winked, pointed toward her head, and uttered that, as she said, this was an ability he already had, and she was nudging him in the right direction. With those words, days were soon blurred into weeks as the Arthur trained with Elder Meyer. They were training, and Meyer remarked that he didn't look out for the spell behind him. The Arthur didn't expect Elder Meyer to use her healing arts as an excuse to give him significant injuries repeatedly. Meyer taught him that proper interruption of mana fluctuation starts with sensing the spells affecting the physical realm. Then, he utilizes Realm Heart to determine what form they will take accurately. The Arthur stretched his shoulder and uttered that if she could heal all the wounds she had given him so quickly, then why not just cut off his legs and grow him new ones? She puts her hand on his shoulder and explains that using ether past a certain threshold comes with costs. Although it's possible to heal significant injuries, she would have to extract the ether, sustaining the life of something or someone else. Arthur thought it would be great if she could stop striking him, which made her laugh, and she remarked that it would be great if he would stop falling for her feints. She wants him to remember that even if his opponent chooses to vocalize their spell, it is what they imagine will affect the spell's size, shape, and duration. In the future, he will encounter enemies that use vocal projection as a feint to trick their opponent or none. It had already been 6 weeks, and Arthur was surprised as she thought he would have gotten this down by now. She reached out to help him and clarified that it was because Arthur was still getting ahead of himself and trying to counter the spell before it manifested. The Arthur told her it was okay as he was fine, and she explained that it took her decades to get it right, and that was considered fast amongst them dragons. He stood again and wanted to start the training. He activated his Realm Heart, thus summoning his runes. Elder Meyer was fully prepared and assembled the particles to attack him. The Arthur focused on it and used wind bullets to damage his skills before being attacked. Elder applauded him as he did well. Then, she used another skill, with which the ground started breaking, and he realized that it was an earth spike under his right foot, so he dodged it. After that, he noticed a blast flare near him and completely destroyed it, after which spikes attacked him from behind. But before he could take any action against it, Elder Winsome appeared, grabbed the spike, and crushed it. Elder Winsome informed them that he feared they were out of time for this practice. Winsome knelt before Mai and apologized for his intrusion. She was delighted to see him and instructed him to rise. The Arthur is stunned, although he deduces that Meyer has a certain level of influence within the Indrath clan. Given her powers and the fact that she had been able to keep Arthur with her, the Arthur didn't know that Winsome would bow to her. Elder Winsome apologized for coming without notice, but Lord Indrath had already arranged for Arthur's next instructor, and was waiting rather impatiently for his student. Meyer understood, as they were all short of time, and clarified that Arthur had done well in his training with Realm Heart. She expressed her wish to keep tabs on the Arthur, hoping there would be no problem if she popped now and then. Winsome glanced at her, nodded his head, and assured her there was no problem. Meyer instructed Arthur to remember what she told him about the world around them and continue his training with Realm Heart. The Arthur affirmed and assured her that he would have it mastered by the next time they saw each other. After that, they bid their farewell, and Arthur left with Winsome. On their way, Winsome kept staring at him. This confused the Arthur, and he inquired if something was wrong. Winsome is amazed by Arthur's luck as Lady Meyer not only takes the time to heal him, but trains him as well. The Arthur inquired who exactly Meyer was. Winsome uttered that he was not in a position to tell him if she hadn't told him herself. The Arthur remarked that when he first met Winsome, he figured that he might be pretty up there, but now, after seeing his attitude toward Meyer, he assumed that Winsome is not so much. This frustrated Winsome, and he told Arthur to watch his tongue. He admitted that he was among the lowest rank of Asuras, but still, he was stronger than any of the lesser races in Dicathan. He instructed him to get inside as his next instructor wasn't one for waiting, and they entered the massive gate. After setting his foot inside, the Arthur was amazed to know that his next training session would be on the vast ground. Winsome explained that with Lady Meyer and his training, Arthur learned mana interpretation and augmented melee combat. Honing various skills is the key aspect necessary for fighting a war. He will start fitting everything into a cohesive style that utilizes his elemental magic and melee combat skills. The Arthur is startled as he hears someone asking if he is the youngster who is supposed to be the hero leading Dicathan to victory against the Vritra-raised armies and their disgusting little Lesherans. The man standing high above the cliff immediately jumped down, and his landing spread dust around the area. After the dust had slightly disappeared, the Arthur was shocked, as a giant hand grasped him, lifted him toward himself, and greeted him. His instructor put him down, after which all the stones gathered around him disassembled, and the man appeared from it. His instructor judged Arthur's expression and guessed it didn't scare him but only surprised him. Winsome introduced Arthur's new instructor, Ren, to him and informed him that he would be his instructor for quite a while, so he wanted them to get acquainted. Arthur bowed before his new master, greeted him, and introduced himself and wanted to be in his care for the time being. Ren asked Winsome what consequences human society places on one who is tardy. The Arthur was shocked and wondered about the consequences of his new master staring at him and uttering that a severed finger or toe would be all right. But that was a bit severe, so he thought imprisonment or social isolation would be more appropriate. The Arthur was confused and being concerned. He stared at both of them and wondered what is he talking about, as these were ridiculous consequences for being a bit late. Winsome uttered it as looked down upon, but no human generally faces any formal charges for being late. This surprised Ren as he discovered no consequences, which seemed quite odd. For a race with such a minuscule lifespan, Ren would have imagined that they placed more importance on time than anything else. He leaned toward the Arthur and remarked that humans are such a backward race, and the Arthur agreed that they are undoubtedly backward. Ren turned around, and his cape struck straight at Arthur's face and struck him. His instructor remarked that regardless of his ignorance, they should move on to why Arthur was there